Hey guys, it's Queen Oseteru, and I'm coming to you today with another exciting edition of Ask An Aquarius. Okay, so in the comment section, a young lady asked me a question. I don't remember her name. It was a couple days ago, and I wrote the question down, but I didn't write her name next to it. But she was a beautiful young lady with blonde hair, and she said to me, do I think there are more or less abusive relationships in 2018? And I wanted to say this from my understanding of relationships and reading about them and learning about them. It seems to me like there probably were more abusive relationships in the past. Because remember, in the past, abusive relationships were not frowned upon. You could beat the shit out of your mom. You could beat the crap out of your kid. Well, maybe not so much your mom, because moms have always been kind of secret. But you could beat the crap out of your wife. You could beat the crap out of your child. And nobody would say anything. I'm talking like the 1900s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and nobody would really say anything. It was only until like the 70s and 80s when people started to give, like in schools and other places, these public service announcements against abuse. I remember I was a kid and McGruff, the crime dog, some of y'all are going to remember this, some of you old heads will remember McGruff, the crime dog. And McGruff would come to the school and would talk about abuse and sex and drugs and all kinds of stuff. And that was like the beginning of that. The 70s and 80s was the beginning of us seeing that these things were wrong and people speaking out against it. So now you probably see a lot more evidence of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, those kind of things. But I think it was more prevalent before because it was okay. If your wife misbehaved, you smacked her around and nobody said anything. And now it still happens. Abuse still goes on, but I think it's more out in the open now. People talk about it more. I see it on talk shows now. I mean, some people even on Facebook talk about being abused or they're currently being abused. I was watching a video the other day and a woman was talking about how her husband had sexually assaulted her, and she was on Facebook live telling the story. So, I mean, it's a lot more open nowadays. People talk about it now. And back then in the 40s, the 30s, you didn't talk about that. If your husband was beating you, you probably covered it up. You would more than likely put on makeup. You would more than likely cover up your bruises because you were, in that time period, especially the further back you go, you were kind of stuck with a man. Once you married him, you were pretty much stuck with him, economically speaking, because you were his property. Literally. And economically speaking, you couldn't really take care of yourself. There was a time period when women couldn't even own property. You couldn't have custody of your kids, things like that. So a lot of women stayed in abusive relationships. A lot of men too, who had, wives that were crazy or, unbalanced or whatever the case is, they just stayed back then. Divorce wasn't as prevalent back in those days. And as a female, there was nothing you could do. If your man was beating you, people would tell you, just deal with it, basically, is what they would tell you. Your own mother might tell you to deal with it, If you watch some of those old movies, like, for instance, there's a movie called What's Love Got to Do with It? And Tina Turner was telling her story. And in one scene, her mom told Ike where she was. Like, once, I think she was at her mom's house, and Ike was like, yeah, where's she at? And she's like, oh, she's here, come get her, like your mother, So I think that back then it was a lot more common, but I think it was just not as heard of. Now you hear about it all the time. And I don't know, it seems to me like now we do have more resources. Like, we have battered women's shelters now. I even saw a shelter for battered men one time, so we have, like, different resources now. When I left my daughter's father, I had to get a restraining order because he and I had a really bad relationship. And there was many, many times when he hit me or pushed me or shoved me, or one time he pushed me and my tooth went through my lip. I've had all kinds of stuff like that happen. And when I got the restraining order, they gave me all kinds of help getting away from him. They helped me get my apartment. They gave me, different, grants and help. And I was in Pennsylvania, and they helped me get away from him. When I worked at a shelter many years later, we would help battered women get to a battered women's shelter in another state. So there's a lot of different organizations now that will help you, that will help a battered woman, that will help a battered husband, that will help, in those situations, even children. Like, back in the day, if you did something to your child, nobody said anything. If your kid had a broken arm or a black eye, nobody said anything. They would question you, the parent would lie, and they would move on. Now they call child protective services on you. One of my friends, she is in her 60s, and she was telling me that when she was a very, 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 very young girl, like 4 years old, she went to the hospital and had an STD, and nobody questioned, why does this 4-year-old have an STD? No, nobody. And if they did question it, nothing happened, because right after she was examined, they sent her back home with the very people who had molested her and gave her the STD. So nowadays, in most cases that I know of, they call child protective services on you, and they come and investigate at the very least. So I think that now it's a lot more known that it's wrong, understood that it's wrong, and people at least make the attempt to do something about it. Whereas in the past, nothing was done about it, and the victims mostly hid it. Most of the victims hid their abuse. Like they did something wrong, like they were ashamed, I've read a lot of stories about women who were abused in the past, a lot of stories about children who were forced to work. Before there were child labor laws, little kids were forced to work. Some of them died from accidents. All kinds of stuff will go on. And now we have laws against this type of thing. So as the years are going on, we're getting more and more laws against these types of things. And so I think that, you hear about it a lot more. But the only thing that seems to me that's really kind of messed up is that we had these laws against it, but I see so many predators not getting convicted. I see, like, I was looking at Facebook the other day, and somebody had posted all of these newspaper clippings of people, mostly it was all men, getting away with abuses, rapes, assaults against kids, against women. I mean, like, it was like a line. It must have been like 15 or 16 of them. Headlines from the swimmer guy that raped that girl to, and it was a priest that tied up a kid, and somebody, it was like a whole list of them. And I was like, wow. And none of these people got convicted, or they got slapped on the wrist, basically, is what they would call it. So we have these laws, but I don't see them being as effective as they really need to be. So that's what I think about the abuse thing. I also think that more than likely, as I've been looking at statistics, people are reporting being more and more unhappy as the years are going on. More and more. Even though they had less money in the past, people are reporting being more unhappy now. So as I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, and one of the effects of so many people being unhappy is there's probably more emotional and mental verbal abuse. You see, when you're unhappy and when you're negative, you have the tendency to be more verbally and mentally and emotionally abusive. So I think that based upon the statistics and saying that there's more and more people who feel like that, I would assume, just from my feelings and from listening to people talk, that more and more people are getting abused in those ways. I think that physical abuse is probably the one that out of all of them will probably be at the bottom, because it seems to me like all the other ones, the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse, those have skyrocketed, But like I said before, people will report this now. I wonder if somebody had done a survey in the 1920s, for example, how many people would have honestly, if they had answered honestly, would have been being physically, emotionally, mentally, sexually abused compared to today. I would love to see those statistics, but they don't exist, because most of those people back then would not have admitted that. Even now it's hard to get somebody to admit it, but they're more likely now than they were in the 1900s. They're much more likely. So we've come a ways in some ways, but we haven't gone anywhere in other ways. You know? So I think that's the answer to the question. I just feel like the thing that's different, another thing that I've noticed that's different now is that relationships are not as strong. You know, I think that like when you look at people now, like I've been talking to a lot of single people, and they'll get in the relationships, or they'll be seeing somebody, and I'm like, the relationships are weird to me now, because it seems like people don't even commit to each other. They meet each other, they have sex, they catch feelings, and then they're ignoring each other within 3 months. You know, whereas before people would actually get into relationships. Now, some of these relationships were not good ones, but they would get into a relationship. It wasn't just what I call a situationship. We have a lot of these situationships going on, and they're giving us a lot of very negative results, unfortunately. And one of those results is that less and less people are staying together and making, you know, a relationship. Less and less people are having longevity. So I think that's the answer to your question. So I think that what we have to do now at this part in our global history is we have to start to utilize the laws that some of us have created, create them in places where they're not created, and use them, utilize them. If somebody goes, you know, up for rape or molestation or something like that, there's no way in hell so many of them should be walking. And so many of them are. It doesn't make sense to me, you know. If you have evidence that this happened and you know that it occurred, why are so many of them walking? In one statement in the newspaper, the judge said that jail would be too hard on the predator. And I'm like, that's strange to me, because the crime definitely was hard on the victim. So why are we now saying that the predator doesn't deserve justice? So I think we have a little ways to go. We have a little ways to go with this concept. But at least awareness is up. And over the next 50, 100 years, hopefully things will get better. Take care. Thank you for your question.